Welcome to another episode of Hype vs. Reality, where we take popular climbing topics and rank them as underrated or overrated and discuss the evidence or lack thereof behind them. Shout out to Real and Nutrition for sponsoring this video. More on their amazing protein powder later to come.
Block pulls instead of hangs for finger training. Disagreement.
Starting with a disagreement. All right, Jason, what do you got?
I love both. I think they're both great. I do both, and I just like block pulls, block lifts simply because I like the unilaterality of it. I like the lower barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. I think that the progressions are slightly easier. Like obviously you can just start with 5 pounds on a block lift. It feels a lot safer for people like when they're nervous about getting into it rather than like their whole body weight. You don't have to set up a counterweight system, which can obviously be a little more cumbersome on time. And I like that you can kind of pay attention to like how you're loading your fingers and your grip type a little bit more. And finally, I think the shoulder engagement with the overhead hang is wonderful, but it also is another just kind of barrier sometimes for people of like, am I doing this right? How am I supposed to be? So without like some of the coaching, I think it's just simpler to get into block pulls.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I use a lot of block pulls myself, but I think that there's two big advantages to a fingerboard over block lifts that can sometimes be forgotten about. I think the biggest one is that, especially for people who haven't done much grip training in the past or who are just getting into sort of supplemental training for climbing, it offers a lot of sort of secondary specificity as far as how you engage your upper body musculature, where you put your plumb line, how you engage on holds in a somewhat more real world situation without costing too much on the sort of like grip isolation side. So I think for a lot of people when they're beginning climbing, fingerboard is a really good option before kind of cycling into or adding no hangs later. Additionally, fingerboards are almost always fixed, and a fixed apparatus is frequently better for strength building than a suspended or more unstable device. So I think they both have their merits. I just think that there's been a big wave of enthusiasm for block lifts, which are excellent, and in some ways that's led to people kind of forgetting about how strong of an offering fingerboards make.
The next topic is arc training.
Mm.
Can you start us off by telling us what arc training is?
Dan can explain it better.
One of the problems with arc training is it's not entirely clear what it is. As with a lot of terms that get kind of invented and popularized in climbing, they're not always super consistent. And so it's a little hard to speak conclusively on underrated or overrated or anything without that. However, generally arc training is a means of building aerobic capacity for longer endurance sport climbing. And it is generally characterized by extremely long times on the wall with extremely low intensities. So this is almost always at a conversational difficulty level where you're not particularly stressed throughout the whole thing. You're generally explicitly told not to try to build a pump, and it's generally for at least 10 minutes, if not quite a bit longer. So there's a lot of gray area and variation there, but that is how I tend to hear it used most often.
All right, why is it overrated?
It could be useful for a lot of climbers. It could be especially useful for beginners, but I don't know that there's a time when I would think of it as the highest bang for your buck activity. I'm almost certain that it's been sort of ported over from preparation for long distance endurance running, where you get essentially volume driven adaptations at a reducing fatigue cost with low intensity. So in running and similar cardio sports, you can do enormous volume at a very low intensity so that you're able to propagate a huge amount of sort of like low grade stress to adapt and prepare for other things without having much of a fatigue cost. In climbing, it doesn't really seem to work like that. It's not mostly a cardiovascularly limited sport. There are, of course, some benefits to be had from overall cardio, but generally speaking, very long, very easy climbing is both too different metabolically from the harder climbing that you're going to be presumably trying, while also generally necessarily being pretty far from your technical limit. So I wouldn't say that for most people it's a very high technical training exercise either.
So I have a feeling that we're going to get at least one comment immediately without addressing it, saying that How can you say that climbing, specifically like sport and trad climbing, is not a cardiovascular limited sport, or at least cardiovascular important sport?
Facts.
Lay them on me.
Yeah.
After the phone rings. Facts. F-A-X.
To get the
Yeah, right.
number, you have to have gone to Google, which shows that they're closed until 12 on Saturday.
They just went, Siri, call the wall
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
Bypass all other information.
I actually wrote this down to try to be a little bit more concise, but the situation is mostly that climbing endurance is limited by local metabolic resilience under repeated ischemia and high tension isometrics. So what that means is you're essentially having a long series of repeated contractions, which are going to be limited by local endurance of the forearms and sometimes shoulders, not really by overall heart rate or like stroke volume or anything like that. That's going to be more limiting in running. So they're fundamentally different systems, and they don't respond equally to different intensities. And generally, by the time you're at a high enough intensity to stimulate the things that are most relevant for climbing, it's not going to be freely recoverable in the same way that it would be for easy running or cycling.
Hot take, walking 10,000 steps a day won't make you really good at jogging. Bro, please forgive me for I have committed many atrocities against the bro code of climbing.
Tell me your sins, my dude.
Well, there was one person that was climbing and clearly needed to be sprayed down by beta, and I didn't. I let them climb without that advice. I forgot to take my shirt off during an entire session. And another time when someone asked for my advice and I forgot to give them the obvious note of just go up, bro.
My dude, try this.
What is this?
Try it.
Dude, that's some gnarly good whey protein, bro.
That, my dude, is plant protein.
Dude, just don't tell the other bros, okay? Because it's delicious. I feel so much better already.
No worries, bro. Hey, by the way,
Yeah.
your project is soft.
No!
Yeah. Great transition into our next topic, which is running for climbers. Ooh, another disagreement of violent.
So Dan and I are gonna really butt heads on this one, like aggressively. I still think it's overrated just because of the benefits I think people are gonna expect from it. I think it's great in many ways. I think if you have a very low overall cardiovascular like capacity, I think it's actually a really good thing. I never discourage people from doing it. I do it myself. The reason I say overrated is because I think people extrapolate the benefits to too great of a level for what it's actually going to do.
Yeah. Man, I kind of have to agree with that also. We're not very good at this. The reason why it feels underrated, I think, to me, is that I've been a lifelong running hater. And I see a lot of my fellow boulders and even a number of sport climbers in kind of the same camp. So while there are some exceptions, I think mostly what I see is people who like running and doing cardio run and do cardio and kind of try to hand wave why it might be good for climbing. And people who don't do running or cardio explain that it's completely useless and that there's no point in doing it at all for climbing performance. And as always, I think it's somewhere in between. Running, well, a stronger cardio base in general seems to be good for improving heart rate variability and sort of stress and fatigue resilience. It seems to help clear local metabolites. There's a number of things psychologically and physiologically that it does that seem to be somewhat beneficial for recovery and possibly even on the wall recovery and or just kind of staying calm when you're feeling like pretty haggard. So there do seem to be a number of benefits, and I myself plan to try to get a little more into my routine. But I don't think I'd ever put it as like a high priority thing for bouldering or sport climbers, I guess if you're doing big mountain days. So not that it's in any sense gonna like revolutionize your climbing, but I think that there's a reasonably good chance that it has a non-negligible benefit if you happen to have time and don't despise it.
All right, the next one is a submission from Instagram from Katie, and it is downsizing climbing shoes.
Wink.
Yeah.
Jason's struggling on this one.
Yeah, that was a struggle for me. I mean, mostly because like there are obviously benefits, but a lot of people take it to extremes.
Yeah.
And especially like my view on it is like if you're a newer climber, you definitely don't need to be super uncomfortable. Like enjoy the sport. Like if you, as you advance in it, you can downsize slowly over time. But like the first pair of shoes, the second pair of shoes you have like don't need to be like insanely aggressively downsized. It's not like that's gonna make you go up 5 grades in climbing. So yeah, overrated for those reasons.
Yeah, I think it's a question of magnitude. You know, it's like you definitely want shoes to be snug. You want your toes to be kind of pressed up against the end. But a lot of people are like, I need a plastic bag and a hydraulic press to get my foot into this, you know? And in the gym, it just basically doesn't matter at almost any level. The times where I've seen it makes the most difference is on really hard, really thin edging, where you're either like standing and supporting full body weight on like tiny, tiny edges outside, or even more so when you're doing laybacks or like hard underclinging against small edges. But that just doesn't happen that often. You destroy shoes relatively fast. It's just sort of more comfortable and easier to climb in something comfortable in the gym. Yeah, honestly, in the gym, just like pick something comfortable. As you climb longer, it's probably good that it's within a half size or so of your performance shoe, though, since you want to be practicing with something kind of similar to what you're going to be performing in.
Hot take, aggressively downsized shoes are cope for shoes that just don't fit you very well.
I think that's potentially a really good point, because I wear my shoes somewhat tight, but I really can comfortably wear them for like all day sessions, you know? There's so many shoes on the market and so many different lasts that it's probably worth finding something that like fits well.
Agreed. Let's do differentiating between overcoming versus yielding isometrics for finger training. Ooh,
Yes.
right, another fight. Fisticuffs.
All right, once again, I think overcoming versus yielding isometrics is one of those things that's not super well or consistently defined. It broadly seems to be that one is utilizing more eccentric structure as you're sort of like resisting opening versus actively closing against a grip, while in both cases being nominally isometric, meaning that the actual angle isn't changing. So it's broadly some intentionality of closure versus opening and resisting. There's probably something there, but I haven't seen any strong research giving magnitude of effect in either direction. In a lot of cases, they're not using things that are like truly equated. Even then, I don't see any demonstrable line to climbing, which is almost exclusively yielding if we were to bother with these kind of terms. So it's not that it's useless, it's an interesting concept, it's worth potentially thinking about, but to me, it's like way down in diminishing returns land, and when people use it, especially more recently, to really like drive and dictate the style of their training, I think that they're sort of losing the forest, you know? Which isn't to say anything about its rightness or wrongness. I think that it's just been like way over promoted.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. It's just wrong. Just kidding. No,
I'm used to that.
I agree. I think the reason I say underrated is because I think it's underrated in the sense of incorporating both into your training can be super useful. Essentially, because I don't think either has proven to be superior to the other, and I think both can have benefits. For example, with more of a yielding, like when you're doing a hang or like a block lift, the benefits can be like the additional weight and somewhat more the specificity towards like hanging on to a hold while climbing. Whereas a lot of people are not going to feel very comfortable doing a hang from like a 10 mil edge, whereas you can do like a recruitment style pull or like an overcoming on a smaller edge and build some like capacity there with just a different training tool that may not involve like hanging a bunch of weight from your fingers. So I think in the sense of having like two different tools, like maybe heavier weight with more the yielding style, and then lighter weight and or like smaller edge training on the overcoming, is actually an underutilized concept for training.
The other thing that I've kind of considered is it seems like normal climbing or normal training to some extent does both, right? Like if I were to like curl or lift something off of the ground, initially we have some sort of overcoming. If I then try to like hold and squeeze as much as I can, it's probably overcoming-ish. at which point if I then take it to at or near failure, it necessarily becomes yielding. So it's like just taking things to near failure ought to do it.
Yeah, I think there's one other disclaimer to add for this, which is simply from perspectives. Like, so Dan focusing on like performance training, and I have a lot more background with like just the recovery component or rehab, whereas like I do pick up on a lot of like neural components and also just fear-based factors, which like a lot of people get hurt and they don't have small edge training, and like doing lifts on small edges is more fearful, and an overcoming style like just seems to be way more comfortable for people in
Way
a
better
recovery
tolerated.
aspect.
Yeah.
Less fear component, more like auto-regulation with it, and so it just suits their needs like way better. But there's also just like the neural components of the recovery, which getting more accustomed to that smaller edge, or just the idea of generating force by pulling in, really does seem to help retrain and like lower like pain levels. And so from that point of view, it's like it's been an invaluable tool.
Yeah.
So they also just add in the niche of the different perspectives.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Let's do one that is hopefully a little bit more clear cut and shorter. We'll see. The next topic is strict rep ranges.
Bacow.
Ooh,
Yeah,
we
agreement.
Double. What are strict rep ranges?
Strict rep ranges are restricting yourself to only using one rep number or a small band of reps for a specific exercise, anticipating that if you go out of that, you will see either different outcomes than you expect or possibly no adaptation to your training. They're very easy to prescribe, and people put a lot of labels on either singular reps as a protocol, like we're doing a 5x5 strength training regime, or, people only do max hangs in a 5-second to 7-second thing, or it becomes somehow hypertrophy or strength endurance oriented. So it is nicely prescriptive, but I think it's also responsible for a huge portion of the plateaus that I see, because people feel that they can't then use that variable of duration to progress or modify their training. And it's like maybe the most adjustable dial with significant overlap in both directions. Basically it just is way too inflexible without a particularly good reason.
I see that a lot in the rehab world, where it's just, we'll just say 3 sets of 10. But like what Dan was saying is it's a huge barrier for people to actually progress and change weights. There's this belief that they have to accomplish the 3 sets of 10, or they cannot change the weight whatsoever. And so they get so stuck and plateaued because like, it kind of feels comfortable 3 sets of 10, and there's no like variability, there's no like adaptation compared to like just doing, do a little bit more weight, but be okay doing less repetitions. So people get really stuck in their recovery because they are inflexible with those rep ranges. And I blame a lot of physical therapists for this, because like it's always just the prescription of 3 sets of 10 with no education that rep range is highly variable.
Yeah.
I agree that like for training purposes also, like it's a huge gray area of like 12 reps is not all that different than 16.
Yeah, or 8,
Or 8.
Yeah.
And having these windows is like a really nice thing. And the thing I should say I've lately focused more education on is like relative intensity. Like if you do 12 repetitions and feel like you had 2 reps left versus like 8 repetitions with a higher weight and had 2 reps left, that relative intensity is very similar.
Yeah.
And so like, and also have fun with it, play with it, like use those different reps so you can play with different weights, and then you get more comfortable with that other weight, because you're like, I can do like 20 pounds instead of just 15. I just had to lower the reps a little bit.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you feel stronger because you allowed yourself to increase to like 20 pounds. So like super overrated strict rep ranges.
Yeah. Training can get really complicated really quickly, and so I think having some guidelines or some place to start is really helpful. But while there's sort of endless complexity, the easiest variables to fiddle with are typically weight and reps kind of equivalently, and sets as only slightly more complicated. So any training you're doing, I would play with all 3 of those variables, and basically every session, ask yourself like which, if any of them, can be either progressed or need to be backed off a little bit. And it suddenly gives you just a wealth of things that you can try to push on while also looking for like which one seems most tolerable at any given time.
TLDR, fitness adaptations happen at a broad range of reps. And so thinking that there's one specific, very hyper-specific range or number of reps that you need to hit for a specific adaptation is a mistake. And you should use that as a progression variable rather than something that you need to look up. How many reps do I need to do for growing biceps?
7.5.
Exactly. The next one is an Instagram submission from Aram. Climbing drills such as hovers, perfect repeats, one-footed climbing, etc.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I say underrated is simply because I think they're underutilized. Outside of like climbing teams, I just don't think many people are using drills, which I think is a disadvantage and hinders their climbing progression.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I don't see people do them that often. I think even in the sort of like worst case, they can help draw attention to certain climbing habits or patterns, so they just make you more conscientious. But I do think that there's a spread between things that are highly focused, highly effective, where you're maybe focusing on like a specific type of movement or a specific pattern, and you can really drill that to perfection, to things that are a little bit less guided and a little bit less specific, which I think have less clear takeaways.
So the next one is roller style or quote unquote frictionless finger training devices. So it's important to note that neither of us have spent a lot of time with any of these devices. I've had some prototypes that I've been testing out myself, but we're just going to be talking about the theory behind them until we actually have a chance to test them out ourselves in depth. So the theory, in short, behind these devices, as far as I understand them, there's essentially two premises. The first one is better ergonomics than a typical edge, which reduces injury risk due to better joint angles and support of the pulleys in certain positions. So essentially a safer way to train grip strength, which is supposed to lead to better adaptations over time and fewer injuries. And then the second premise is better isolation of the individual gripping muscles, the FDP and the FDS. So by isolating them or biasing them more than a typical edge, you are supposedly able to get better adaptations once again.
Yeah, I mean, overrated, we don't have data to support that. We just have newer claims. I mean, not only like Emil pointed out, like we haven't had enough time to play with them. No one has had enough time to play with them to make such claims. There's problems with a lot of it. The injury reduced risk theory is inaccurate in the sense of if you're reducing load to the pulleys, then sure, they are going to have less injury risk with that particular training tool. But if they have reduced load to them, then they are not getting the same training adaptations that you need on the wall, which means you're not reducing injury risk for that structure on the wall. Traditional edges, especially on smaller edges where you have some amount of like DIP joint extension or hyperextension, will also create more load to the volar plate, which when done properly with training helps make that tissue more resilient, which reduces injury risk. So if you have no load to that, then you are not actually creating more resiliency, which is in theory then not reducing injury risk. The other component of like isolating FDP and FDS is a little also overstated. You can't really isolate the FDS. The FDS is responsible for PIP joint flexion, and I say responsible, that's actually like the wrong word because it implies sole responsibility. The FDP is always going to help with that because the FDP does MCP, PIP, and DIP joint flexion. The FDS does MCP and PIP joint flexion. So there is overlap with the FDP and the FDS on that. And just isolating those two variables, we also have no data to say that that is more efficient or better for your training anyway. In fact, I would argue against in the sense of isolating FDS will mean theoretically no or minimal load to the A4 pulley or the DIP volar plate. And then that means no adaptation and no increased resiliency of those structures, which would not increase your climbing performance, nor would it decrease your injury risk.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the risk of injury using the implement could be reduced specifically with those connective tissues, but that could end up being a bad thing on the wall.
Correct.
Yeah.
We just don't really know, but it's plausible that it could be.
Correct.
Okay.
I guess I see how there's an attractiveness to the chain of logic that they're promoting, but the problem is that there's no hard data supporting basically any of the claims. So we don't have good reason to think that it in fact isolates those muscles. We don't know that it's beneficial to isolate those muscles, and we don't know that if one was successful doing so, that it would produce better sports performance. So kind of like lacking data to support that. It also flies kind of in the face of best practice, both currently in climbing and generally in sport. You're taking something that's going to be more unstable and less specific and hypothesizing that it's going to produce a stronger signal. But on top of there just not being good reason for that, there's reason to think that that's maybe not the case, which is that you have broadly 3 mechanisms that increase strength output, which is going to be essentially connective tissues, neural coordinations and strengths, and actual muscle hypertrophy. The connective tissue and the neural coordination is going to be demonstrably, well, you could very well argue that it would not be expected to be better with this type of product because it's going to either not do what it's suggesting or not load the connective tissue that you need to strengthen. It's going to have a poorer signal for neural training and coordination than something that looks more like what you're trying to train directly. And hypertrophy has been well demonstrated to be extremely flexible. So basically any other thing that you're able to take to roughly near failure across a very wide intensity range is going to have equivalent outcomes, at least. So there's not that I've seen a good argument for why this would produce adequately better hypertrophy outcomes to essentially outweigh its inefficiencies in these other areas. It's just hard for me to see how it would be expected to have better outcomes than current best practices, which is of course not to say that it would have no outcomes. And I think that's where people get mixed up sometimes. You have a thing, it imposes a stress, you increase your efficacy with that thing and possibly some adjacent things. I'm not going to say that it wouldn't work at all, but I would be very surprised if it worked better than other options.
This is another Instagram submission. This one's from Grady, and it is the Tindeq, or force gauges in general. And he says he's very interested in the community's opinions on the Tindeq. Seems to me that it's very expensive for what it offers. But let's just start with Tindeq or other force gauges.
Disclaimer, we have an affiliate with Pitch 6 and Tindeq. We've used these devices for a very long period of time, but that bias needs to be said first. Oh, wait.
You gotta rate them.
Rate it.
Yeah, I think a little bit underrated, yeah.
Yeah. I can't argue against what the viewer is saying because they are kind of pricey. But I think because they last a very long time, and for what they offer, I think if it's affordable to you, it's worthwhile for many different reasons. I think it's an invaluable tool for creating benchmarks, and benchmarks are super useful for any kind of injury recovery.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have benchmarks and are starting with an injury recovery, being able to compare a healthy to an injured side is also invaluable. Not only from just the physical component of knowing how well you're doing in recovery, also the mental component of how well should I be climbing versus oh, I have a 50% strength deficit. I'm going to be a little more cautious versus, oh, I'm at 90% now, and you get a little more adventurous. So having those numbers with that can be really useful. The Tindeq also is very varied in allowing you to introduce more training tools or things you haven't done. Maybe you've never played with single finger loads and don't want to do a block lift of it. You can use a Tindeq for that. But most importantly, and I feel Dan is also going to agree and talk to this, I love using it as a warm-up tool, especially for outdoor climbing. Saves skin like, and then also lets me know when I'm like at my benchmarks for certain things, and so I'm ready to climb, and just invaluable for that reason.
Yeah.
That was not very concise, though, was it? Do you want me to try again real quick?
No, that's okay.
Yeah. I personally love my Tindeq. I think that it's important to note that it's like a lot of the things that you can do with it, you of course could do with normal block lifts and physical weights or a fingerboard and a pulley or something like that. So most of its utility is not unique, and you shouldn't feel obliged to buy one or think that you're like missing out on like massive training opportunities or anything. But I have found that I really like it for rehab. Sometimes with injuries, it's like the plates that you have available don't offer a small enough step size or a continuous enough progression. It certainly is much more convenient for a warm-up, and it's like vastly useful to me, both for a warm-up and for training when I'm on travel and you don't have access to weights or can't reasonably get weights. So there's a number of situations where it just is the option. You know, you can pull against your foot or you could have a force gauge. And I find that like pulling against something that tells me a readout versus just like tying something to a tree or a leg or something, I get a lot better feedback and engagement when I get to see how hard I'm pulling. So I find it to be a really useful, flexible warm-up and training tool when I'm on the go. I feel like it is something that I'm more comfortable with rehab, and it lets me rapidly fiddle about with various like personal benchmarks or experiments that I wouldn't be able to access as easily otherwise. So those are like the merits of it. As far as price, it is a good point, but there's at least a use case to consider, which is weights are pretty expensive also. So like if you have access to a gym and you get to do block lifts there and they have fractional weight plates, or you simply buy fractional weight plates, like there are cheaper alternatives that are just as effective. However, if you want a training setup at home, just buying a force gauge is going to give you a lot of opportunity beyond even what you can do with weights, and is probably going to be less expensive.
I also thought of one thing when I was saying it, and then reinforced with Dan, was there, yeah, you can use alternates. Like even my example of, well, if your healthy hand can lift 100 pounds and your injured is like 70 pounds, then you know you're at like 70%. But the issue I have with that sometimes is actually people really want to feel like they're like closer and closer, so they might like push the weight heavier than they should and do like a heavier block lift and then maybe have like a small setback. Whereas with the Tindeq, it seems to be a lot better auto-regulated, and people seem to, especially like when you ramp up the force slower rather than just picking the weight up, people seem to stop at better pain-regulated levels. And so it's somewhat more accurate and somewhat better at like preventing a little bit of excessive force just to try and like feel healthier.
Yeah, especially if you don't look at it. It's not possible to blind yourself to like how much weight you have on a pin.
Exactly.
TLDR, Tindeq is one of many tools available to climbers that offers a variety of useful features, but is by no means essential for your progression in climbing.
Yeah, underrated but not irreplaceable.
All right, the next topic is being a pro climber as a qualification for being a climbing coach.
Yeah.
I think we'll let the professional climber and climbing coach take this one.
I think that being expert in your field is generally helpful, but teaching is hard and not everyone can do it. And I think that finding someone who's a good teacher who resonates with you is likely going to be more beneficial than finding somebody who is very masterful but can't necessarily communicate it.
Don't forget to use that code HoopersBeta at checkout for 25% off your entire reel end order. And also, don't forget to check out our other products, like our physical products for training, our recovery blueprints, and our amazing coaching with Dan.